Federalist 46, Part 1, Madison continues his argument that he was making in Federalist 45. To the people who say the federal government is going to have too much power, it's going to crush the state governments or make the state governments irrelevant and unimportant, he says, no way. This idea, he uses the word chimerical 2 or 3 times. And what he means by that, it's chimera is a thing which is hoped for, but is illusory and impossible to achieve, like a fantasy. He says these people have fantasy in their heads when they say that federal government is going to do such a thing. Our critics, anti-federalists. And in this paper, he actually spends quite a bit of time saying that Americans are too free-spirited and liberty-loving to allow the federal government to do that. Just like we stood up to the British, the Americans will stand up to the federal government. He even counts the number of soldiers that a federal government can put together, and he says, look, Americans are many more than the number of troops the federal government will have, and also they're armed. And then the states will choose their officers, their main officers, and under these state-led efforts, they can stand up and crush the federal government. He actually comes, in this paper, he comes pretty close to saying that no way the federal government is going to be that strong because people of the United States will crush it. So the states will have majority of the loyalty of the people. That is just natural. So let's start reading this article. Because it is very evident, very clear in what he wants to say, I'm not going to make too many comments here in this paper. Resuming the subject of the last paper, I proceed to inquire whether the federal government or the state governments will have the advantage with regard to predilection and support of the people. Notwithstanding the different modes in which they are appointed, we must consider both of them as substantially dependent on the great body of the citizens of the United States. And here's another thing that you have to constantly remember. He says, whatever happens, at the end of the day, American people are the fountain of power, are the source of power. They have the ultimate say. So regardless of which government gets too big and not responsive to the people, people can replace these representatives, throw them out. And at the worst case scenario, they can even rebel, have an armed rebellion and crush the government. I assume this position here as it respects the first, reserving the proofs for another place. The federal and state governments are in fact but different agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designed for different purposes. The adversaries of the Constitution seem to have lost sight of the people altogether in their reasonings on this subject. Seem to have lost sight of the people altogether in their reasoning on this subject, and to have viewed these different establishments not only as mutual rivals and enemies, but as uncontrolled by any common superior in their efforts to usurp the authorities of each other. These gentlemen must here be reminded of their error, have to be reminded that people are still the boss. Seems like these anti-federalists who are criticizing us have forgotten the people themselves. They're talking as if the people are not there. American people are freedom-loving. They'll stand up for their rights. These gentlemen must here be reminded of their error. They must be told that the ultimate authority, wherever the derivative may be found, resides in the people alone, that it will not depend merely on the comparative ambition or address of the different governments, whether either or which of them will be able to enlarge its sphere of jurisdiction at the expense of the other. Truth, no less than decency, requires that the event in every case should be supposed to depend on the sentiments and sanction of their common constituents. Now I go to the second paragraph. Many considerations, besides those suggested on a former occasion, seem to place it beyond doubt that the first and most natural attachment of the people will be to the governments of their respective states. Into the administration of these a greater number of individuals will expect to rise. From the gift of these a greater number of offices and emoluments will flow. By the superintending care of these, all the more domestic and personal interests of the people will be regulated and provided for. With the affairs of these, the people will be more familiarly and minutely conversant, and with the members of these will a greater proportion of the people have the ties of personal acquaintance and friendship, and of family and party attachments. On the side of these, therefore, the popular bias may well be expected most strongly to incline. So he keeps on saying these. He's talking about majority of the people will have attachment. They'll be closer to their state officials. These people, these state officials, are the ones that are going to be getting paid immediately by people who are close to them, the residents of those states. So there is no way that people in any state are going to not be attached to their state government more than the federal government. So Madison is telling his critics, what is your fear? These people will be loyal to the states more than they will be to the federal government. It's natural. The next paragraph, experience speaks the same language in this case. The federal administration, though hitherto very defective in comparison with what may be hoped under a better system, had during the war, and particularly whilst the independent fund of paper emissions was in credit, an activity and importance as great as it can well have in any future circumstance whatsoever. It was engaged, too, in a course of measures which had for their objects the protection of everything that was dear and the acquisition of everything that could be desirable to the people at large. It was nevertheless invariably found, after the transient enthusiasm for the early congresses was over, that the attention and attachment of the people were turned anew to their own particular governments, that the federal council was at no time the idol of popular favor, and that opposition to proposed enlargements of its powers and importance was the side usually taken by the men who wished to build their political consequence on the prepossessions of their fellow citizens. He says, look, even right after this war, towards the end of this Revolutionary War, and right after it, we saw that immediately people were concerned and were closer and were paying more attention to their states, state officials, state governments, and their interest in the Congress. He's talking about the federal, the Confederation Congress under the Articles of Confederation, their first Congress, under the old Constitution. People's attachment turned from that Congress and towards their states. So he says experience even teaches us differently, that people are going to be attached to their state governments more than they will be to the federal government.